Right, thanks for joining me on this project. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background to the story, the setting, the context, the characters, what gave me the ideas that spurred the story. It's set in the Loire Valley, starting in 1980, but with flashbacks to the 1940s and the events that made the characters what they are today and what set up the tensions of today, which is 1980. The Loire Valley, beautiful, just extraordinary. An enormous river running basically east-west right out to the Atlantic coast. It's always been strategically important. It's an important trade route. Trade is brought up from the seaports right up to Angers, Saumur, Tours, Orléans. It's an important navigational area. It was a frontier area between the English and French kings. And in fact, Henry II, his son Richard Coeur de Lion, and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine are all buried at Fontevraud Abbey, not far from Saumur. So it's always been recognised as strategically important. During the war, it was the frontier between the Germans and the French. This had actually been anticipated by the commander of the riding school at Saumur, the Cadre Noir, because they'd been having war games annually where they simulated a German invasion of France, stopping at the Loire, and the French mounting a defence of the south bank. In the games, the war games, they anticipated that to hold a 40-kilometre stretch of river they would need 80,000 men. In practice, they had 2,190. Mostly cadets drawn from the Saumur Cavalry School. A lot of them, 800 or so, had only joined the cavalry school about 3 months before, so they were basically untrained, just enthusiastic volunteers. Now the Germans overwhelmed the French and British defences in the Second World War in May. They overran France in about 5 weeks, but that wasn't down to any lack of courage on the part of the opposing armies. It was just an organisational and strategic disaster. There were ammunition dumps all over France that were completely untouched. They'd fallen back so fast they didn't know what was happening. The Loire was a gathering point. These cadets mounted a defence, but they had virtually no ammunition or weapons. They had a few old tanks. They pulled some old guns out of the museum, literally out of the museum. Some of them didn't work. But there wasn't much ammunition to mount a defence. They were up against 10,000 Germans on the other side, who were largely mechanised. They had armoured vehicles, they had artillery. Overwhelmingly superior force to the French. The French blew up the 5 bridges that were in the line of attack. A couple of them were 2 islands in the middle of the Loire. So you actually had a bridge onto the island and then a bridge off. At the defence of Gênes, there was an Algerian company of riflemen who dug in on the island. Then they blew the northern bridge, leaving the southern bridge for them to retreat. And then some idiot gave the order that the southern bridge should be blown as well, so they were trapped on the island. So we lost a large part of the defence force there. Eventually the Germans crossed the Loire further west, and they made some inroads between Saumur and Gênes, and the French just didn't have the resources to fight them all. Their defence lasted only 3 days. It was a heroic but ultimately futile defence. Now the officers commanding this were also instructors at the Cadre Noir. Very often they were minor aristocrats, and as you know, France is populated by minor chateaux, about 40,000 chateaux in France. They're all over the place. Even La Lonchal, population 113, has a chateau. It's extraordinary, the wealth there must have been concentrated in so few hands. These aristocrats invested a lot of money in Russia before the Russian Revolution, and they lost the lot. They lost everything. So they were dramatically anti-Russian and anti-communist. So it's not surprising that a lot of these French people were turned when the Germans invaded Russia and sided with the Germans to fight the Russians. It seemed they'd been fighting the wrong enemy. So it's not surprising that a lot of Frenchmen joined up. And in fact, one of the last fighting units on the Axis side, on the German side, was a French unit. They fought to the very last in April, May 1945. So I went on holiday. I went out one day to buy a loaf of bread and came back with a house, basically. Actually, the house didn't cost much more than a loaf of bread. It was ridiculously cheap, just stupidly cheap. But I bought the house, and it's not a house, it's a wreck. It's better now, but it was a wreck. Now, the house had been empty for some years. Prior to that, it had been occupied by a woman living there on her own for 30 years. A reclusive woman, very rarely went out. When I walked into the house, I saw how she lived. Inside the one room downstairs was a table. On the table was a bottle of Cointreau. There was a sink, a stove, a bed, and a bucket, and that was it. No toilet, no bathroom facilities. She used the bucket. When the bucket was full, she emptied it in a sluice by the well. It went through a pipe into the neighbour's ditch and around the corner behind his barn and back into her own ditch again. So it's very fertile now, but what a way to live. 30 years like that. Why was she a reclusive? Why didn't she ever go out? Got my mind working. I spoke to Henri next door, who was a teenager in the war. He told me that after the Allied invasion, it was pretty much chaos, anarchy in France. If you wanted a car and you saw a German driving a car, you shot him and you took the car and nothing was done. It was anarchy. After the liberation, there was a lot of retribution against people who were seen as collaborators, and particularly against women who fraternised. Well, you can understand why. I mean, the young men had gone. They'd been forced to labour camps, or they were in prisoner of war camps, and these lorry loads of young, attractive men arrived from Germany. They must have seemed exotic. They're just people. You can't blame people for falling in love. And that's what happened very frequently, and ended tragically. So this story is about a woman who fell in love with a German who was a musician. It makes a difference if you've got two musicians, because music is an international language. It needs no words. You can communicate through music, and these two fall in love. But it's a forbidden love, because Giselle is married. But unfortunately, her husband, an officer at the Cadre Noir, has been inveigled into signing up for the German Foreign Brigade and is off on the Eastern Front fighting the communists, and that's where Heinz moves in, initially only to play the piano, but he needed someone to sing with as well. And I take the story from there. It's very complicated. I can't give too much of the story away at this point because it's just too jolly difficult to explain. It's a very complicated plot, and I don't know why I wrote it. But anyway, thanks for joining this. I hope you enjoyed this project. I think it will carry a message at the end of it, which is that nations cannot be characterized as bad. Sometimes people are bad, but it's ideologies that do the damage, the extremes that result in inhumane actions that ordinary people get dragged into if they don't do something to resist it. So I think it's got a message for everybody right now.